the winter of 1502, inside the fortified stone walls of Senigallia on the Adriatic coast, 4 powerful Italian warlords arrived to dine with Cesare Borgia, believing they were negotiating an alliance of equals. Cinematic slow-motion shot of heavy iron-studded wooden gates grinding shut behind 4 armored Italian captains, casting long shadows across wet cobblestones in pale winter moonlight. They brought armed retinues, decades of combined military prestige, and the intoxicating assumption that, because they were dangerous men, they could not be conquered from within. Within 3 hours, their retinues were quietly disarmed outside the perimeter. The banquet hall doors were bolted from the exterior, and Vitalaz, Vitelli, and Oliverado de Fermo were strangled to death with silk cords before the feast had even gone cold. Dark macro shot of a velvet-draped feast table littered with overturned silver chalices, spilled dark wine pooling like blood across an unrolled parchment treaty. Sitting quietly in the adjacent chamber, taking rapid, razor-sharp notes in the faint glow of tallow candlelight, was a 33-year-old diplomatic envoy from Florence named Niccolò Machiavelli. He did not witness a simple massacre of rivals. He witnessed an absolute masterclass in the primary law that governs every hierarchy of wealth, statecraft, and human dominance. The man who displays his power prematurely will always be devoured by the man who knows how to operate beneath the threshold of perception. Macro close-up of an antique iron quill scratching Latin script rapidly across rough vellum by flickering tallow candlelight. What history forgets to tell you about that cold night in Senigallia is that the victims did not die because they lacked soldiers, silver, or land. They died because they violated the very first structural phase of sovereign ascension. They accumulated visible leverage before they had secured the institutional architecture to defend it. They were loud, arrogant, and prematurely triumphant in a theater filled with predators who had spent decades learning how to smile, while calculating the precise trajectory of a fatal incision. Cinematic tracking shot through a subterranean stone corridor lined with torch sconces, mist rolling across the flagstones. Most men who spend their lives attempting to cross the threshold from financial servitude to sovereign wealth operate under an optical illusion, cultivated by the very systems that harvest their labor. They are taught that wealth is the natural byproduct of sweat, visible diligence, linear accumulation, and adherence to established civic morality. They believe that if they simply work harder, announce their ambitions to the world, and construct an honest enterprise within the rules drawn by existing power structures, the world will eventually reward them with autonomy. Atmospheric drone shot descending slowly over a monolithic modern glass and steel financial skyscraper, surrounded by low-hanging nocturnal fog. This is the foundational lie of the modern economic arena. The global ledger is not an egalitarian meritocracy designed to reward earnest exertion. It is an unforgiving geopolitical battleground where capital behaves precisely like an empire. It expands through asymmetry, defends itself through silent siege warfare, and systematically liquidates anyone naive enough to broadcast their intentions before their defenses are impenetrable. Cinematic low-angle shot of an imposing Renaissance marble statue of a hooded sovereign gazing down into an empty cathedral nave. Machiavelli understood that to transform from a dispensable instrument of another man's empire into a sovereign force of your own, you must navigate 3 distinct, non-negotiable stages of strategic power. The overwhelming majority of ambitious men fail in the first stage, not because they lack raw capability, but because their vanity compels them to signal wealth before they have acquired structural leverage. They buy the outward symbols of prosperity to manufacture the illusion of victory, unaware that in the cold calculus of high-stakes capital, visibility without sovereignty is simply an invitation to be plundered. Close-up of a vintage brass scale tipping violently as heavy gold florins are dropped onto one side, while the other side rises into shadow. Consider the Italian peninsula at the turn of the 16th century. A fragmented, blood-soaked landscape where fragile merchant republics were perpetually crushed between the massive imperial weight of France, Spain, and the papacy. Florence, despite its unparalleled cultural renaissance and mountains of gold florins, existed in a state of perpetual terror. Why? Because the Florentines believed their immense liquid wealth alone could protect them. They hired mercenary captains, spent vast sums buying temporary truces, and lived under the delusion that gold can command men who understand the brutal mechanics of real power. Dramatic wide shot of a Renaissance battleground at dawn, broken pikes and torn silk banners emerging through thick gray smoke. Machiavelli watched this dynamic with absolute contempt. In his private dispatches, he warned that money is not the sinews of war, despite what common opinion dictated. Gold, without internal discipline and absolute strategic autonomy, does not defend a state. It merely makes it a more lucrative target for the sovereign predator, who understands how to orchestrate a silent siege. Cinematic shot of an antique brass compass spinning erratically on a weathered nautical map of the Mediterranean, illuminated by a solitary candle flame. The fatal mistake was not losing the battle, but revealing the intent. When you look at the modern financial landscape, the parallels are chillingly exact. The average individual enters the economic arena stripped of institutional insulation. They trade their life force for a fixed wage, immediately surrender that wage to consumer debt and systemic inflation, and broadcast every minor triumph on digital networks designed to monetize their psychological insecurity. They are operating as unpaid mercenaries in an economic empire they do not control, mistaking the outward appearance of consumption for the reality of financial sovereignty. Moody, high-contrast shot of modern surveillance monitors glowing in a dark room, displaying abstract green market feeds and biometric heat maps to escape this systemic extraction. You must undergo what Machiavelli described as the total eradication of idealistic hope. You must see the architecture of wealth not as a collection of numbers in a bank account, but as a system of defensive ramparts, asymmetric supply lines, and cold levers of psychological influence. Real wealth is not the capacity to consume luxury. It is the absolute freedom from being compelled by another human being's sovereign decree. Cinematic macro shot of an iron portcullis slowly descending into stone grooves, sealing a fortress vault in complete darkness. The first phase of this transformation requires the absolute concealment of your trajectory. In a world that screams for attention, the sovereign strategist cultivates an impenetrable facade of ordinary compliance. You do not argue with the institutional gatekeepers. You do not announce your radical plans to family, peers, or competitors. You smile, you nod, you absorb every scrap of tactical intelligence the environment provides, and you construct your independent infrastructure in the absolute silence of the dark. Cinematic slow-motion shot of a shadowy figure in a tailored dark overcoat walking calmly down an empty, rain-slicked European boulevard at midnight. Every empire that ever endured was built upon this principle of strategic dissimulation. When the young Octavian navigated the treacherous aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination in ancient Rome, he did not immediately declare his intention to become the first emperor. He allied himself with his bitterest enemies, appeared humble and subservient to the Senate, and quietly consolidated the loyalty of the veteran legions until the entire apparatus of the Republic was an empty shell, completely dependent on his personal authority. By the time the old aristocracy realized what had occurred, the transition of sovereign power was already an irreversible historical fact. Wide cinematic shot of the Roman Forum ruins shrouded in dense morning mist, ancient marble pillars standing silent against a stormy sky. The paradox of the modern climber is that he wants the applause of victory before he has survived the quiet discipline of the siege. He seeks social validation, external prestige, and immediate gratification. But in the doctrine of ruthless wealth, premature visibility is the highest form of self-sabotage. If your rivals know your target, they will poison the wells along your path. If the market detects your accumulation before you have locked in your position, the cost of entry will rise exponentially against you. Extreme close-up of an hourglass where the black sand flows with hypnotic, agonizing precision in near-total darkness. To survive the first crucible of the Machiavellian blueprint, you must become entirely comfortable with being underestimated. Let them believe you are ordinary. Let them assume you are satisfied with the standard crumbs of the corporate and civic machine. Behind that mundane facade, you systematically strip away all non-essential consumption, redirect every fraction of your energy into the acquisition of asymmetric assets, and construct the psychological fortitude required to hold the line when the economic landscape inevitably fractures. Cinematic panning shot across a dark study filled with towering bookshelves, an antique globe, and a single chess game paused mid-maneuver on an ebony table. What Machiavelli discovered in the blood-stained courts of Renaissance Europe remains permanently etched into the architecture of modern power. The foundation of all sovereign dominance is not the gold in your vault, but the cold calculus of when to strike, when to retreat, and how to make the entire world believe you are powerless until the moment your grip on the machinery of wealth is absolute. Once the facade of ordinary compliance is perfected, you enter the second and most dangerous crucible of the blueprint, the realm of calculated confrontation, cold psychological maneuvering, and the weaponization of human leverage. Cinematic slow-motion shot of a silver signet ring pressing hot scarlet sealing wax onto a classified dispatch against an ebony desk. History rarely records the silent shifts of power that happen long before a territory falls. In the spring of 1500, when Cesare Borgia set his sights on the Romagna region, he recognized an immutable law that every modern empire builder must eventually confront. You cannot dismantle an entrenched hierarchy by confronting it on its own moral terms. The established order wrote those rules specifically to preserve its own supremacy and ensure your perpetual subjugation. Dark, atmospheric wide shot of a fortified medieval citadel perched atop a jagged mountain peak during a gathering thunderstorm. Borgia did not march headlong into fortified cities to engage in costly, symmetrical warfare. Instead, he deployed Ramiro de Lorqua, a ruthless and efficient lieutenant, granting him absolute authority to crush civil disobedience, eliminate local crime syndicates, and enforce order through sheer, unadulterated terror. Lorqua executed the mandate with brutal precision, pacifying the entire province in a matter of months. Cinematic tracking shot through a rain-slicked courtyard where an armored executioner stands perfectly motionless beside a wooden chopping block. Then came the psychological masterstroke that Machiavelli analyzed with cold admiration. Once the pacification was complete, and the populace simmered with deep-seated hatred toward the tyranny that restored their stability, Borgia knew that the resentment had to be redirected before it hardened into open rebellion against his own crown. Macro shot of an antique steel dagger slowly slicing through a heavy velvet tapestry depicting a sovereign crown. On the morning of December 26, 1502, the citizens of Cesena woke to find Ramiro de Lorqua's body cut in half in the middle of the central piazza, placed on a wooden block with a bloody knife beside it. Borgia had simultaneously eliminated a dangerous subordinate, whose ambitions might one day rival his own, appeased the furious populace by presenting himself as an avenger of their grievances, and demonstrated the terrifying, unhesitating wrath that awaited anyone who dared challenge his absolute sovereign will. Cinematic high-contrast shot of an empty, fog-covered piazza at dawn, a solitary raven circling above wet stone flagstones. The fatal mistake modern climbers make in this second stage is confusing emotional loyalty with structural alignment. In the ruthless pursuit of wealth, people do not follow you because they admire your virtue or sympathize with your struggles. They align with you because you control the incentives that govern their survival. When you understand the psychological architecture of leverage, You stop asking for concessions, partnerships, or favors. You construct scenarios where cooperation with your objectives is the other party's only logical path to self-preservation. Cinematic medium shot of an elite boardroom engulfed in shadow. A solitary green desk lamp illuminating a ledger of binding contracts. Every high-level negotiation, every strategic acquisition, and every market penetration is a silent battle of asymmetric information. If you reveal your vulnerabilities, your desperate need for a deal, or your emotional attachment to an asset, you immediately become Ramiro de Lorqua, a temporary instrument ready to be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's balance sheet. Dark cinematic close-up of two men in tailored black suits sitting across a glass table, their faces completely obscured by heavy shadows. What history forgets to tell you about the consolidation of immense wealth is that it requires an almost surgical detachment from sentimentality. You must view your capital, your time, and your relationships through the lens of strategic utility. Machiavelli wrote that it is far safer to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both, because love is held by a chain of obligation which men, being selfish by nature, break whenever it serves their advantage. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment that never fails. Macro shot of heavy iron chains slowly tightening around a polished marble column, cracking the stone with deep groans. In the modern financial warfare arena, fear is not physical violence. Fear is the sovereign capacity to walk away from any table, to cut off critical access, to render a competitor obsolete, or to enforce a contract with devastating financial finality. When you hold absolute leverage, you never need to raise your voice, issue public threats, or engage in theatrical disputes. The calm, quiet certainty of your asymmetric advantage speaks with more authority than 1,000 armies. Cinematic slow-motion shot of a silhouette figure standing by a penthouse window overlooking a sprawling city grid at night, rain streaking across the glass. For those seeking to decode the deepest mechanisms of historical statecraft and apply these timeless doctrines to modern financial dominance, you can access our private library of classified strategic dossiers linked in the description below. Cinematic low-angle shot of a hidden, leather-bound library vault illuminated by warm amber sconces, heavy folios stacked on dark mahogany shelves. To successfully execute this second stage, you must master the art of the psychological counteroffensive. When external forces attempt to pressure your position, whether through predatory taxation, institutional regulation, or hostile market competitors, you do not react with impulsive defiance. Defiance exposes your position and burns your reserves. Instead, you create strategic dilemmas where every move your adversary makes actively strengthens your structural moat. Cinematic macro shot of an ivory chess knight toppling a black king on an antique slate board, illuminated by a single shaft of pale light. Consider how the Rothschild banking dynasty navigated the brutal volatility of the Napoleonic Wars. They did not merely finance armies. They constructed an unmatched private intelligence network across Europe that outperformed the official diplomatic couriers of every sovereign state. When Nathan Rothschild received confirmed intelligence of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo hours before the British government, he did not rush to celebrate or boast of his exclusive knowledge. Dramatic tracking shot through a smoky, frantic 19th century London exchange floor, panic-stricken brokers screaming in chaotic darkness. He walked into the London Stock Exchange and began quietly, methodically dumping British government consols. The market panicked, assuming Rothschild knew that Britain had lost the war. Prices collapsed in an absolute frenzy of fear. At the absolute nadir of the panic, through dozens of anonymous agents operating in the shadows, Rothschild bought up the entire British debt market for pennies on the pound before the official dispatch arrived. By the time the truth was revealed, he owned the sovereign debt of the most powerful empire on earth. Extreme macro shot of a single gold pocket watch ticking methodically as shadow completely envelops its Roman numerals. The lesson is absolute. Perception is the ultimate currency of the sovereign strategist. If you can manipulate the perception of your strength, your weakness, your intentions, and your reserves, you control the behavior of every player in your theater of operation. You make them move when you wish them to move, panic when you need liquidity, and surrender their positions while convinced they are making a prudent escape. Cinematic overhead shot of an intricate stone labyrinth, a single dark figure navigating effortlessly toward the illuminated center. Stage 2 demands that you shed every trace of intellectual fragility. You must stop seeking the comfort of majority consensus and learn to feast upon systemic volatility. While the untrained masses freeze in terror at the first sign of economic distress, the Machiavellian mind recognizes that chaos is the great reallocator of sovereign wealth, stripping assets from the hands of the naive and transferring them into the iron grasp of those who prepared for the siege. With the psychological battlefield secured and your competitors maneuvered into position, you arrive at the third stage of sovereign ascension, systemic execution and the architecture of modern financial warfare. Cinematic slow motion shot of heavy mechanical vault gears interlocking and rotating with brutal precision behind thick reinforced steel. This is the phase where abstract strategy transforms into physical, undeniable dominion. In this crucible, wealth ceases to be a defensive reserve and becomes an offensive siege engine. To build an empire that cannot be dismantled by economic turbulence, you must abandon the amateur pursuit of linear income and construct self-reinforcing systems of capital capture. Cinematic tracking shot through a vast, subterranean server farm illuminated only by pulsing blue and green status indicators against black server racks. In the high-stakes corridors of Renaissance statecraft, Machiavelli observed that the most resilient princes did not depend on fortune, seasonal harvest, or the fickle favor of external patrons. They built their authority upon institutions they owned entirely, operated through domestic arms, and insulated with diversified, unassailable revenue engines. Dark, moody shot of an antique brass astrolabe aligned over complex financial ledger sheets marked with red wax stamps. The modern equivalent of this fortress is the sovereign holding apparatus, a layered corporate and legal architecture that separates the creator of value from the liability of its creation. You do not hold wealth in your personal name where it can be targeted by frivolous litigation, predatory taxation, or bureaucratic confiscation. You hold it within a perimeter of anonymous trusts, holding entities, and sovereign jurisdictions designed to absorb shocks without transferring kinetic force to the center. Macro shot of a fountain pen drawing crisp geometric boundaries across an international maritime jurisdiction map. What history forgets to tell you about the consolidation of immense capital is that true power does not compete in saturated markets. It captures the bottlenecks through which everyone else must pass. Consider the strategy of Cosimo de' Medici in 15th century Florence. He did not build his empire by offering marginally better banking terms than his rivals. He systematically financed the papal curia, securing the exclusive right to collect tithes across Christian Europe and monopolizing the mines of Talfa, the continent's sole domestic source of alum, a mineral indispensable for the textile industry that powered the European economy. Cinematic wide shot of an ancient stone quarry bathed in harsh shadows, dust hanging motionless in the cold morning air. If you wanted to produce cloth in Flanders, trade silk in Venice, or dye wool in Florence, you paid a silent tribute to the Medici. They did not shout their dominance from the rooftops. They owned the choke points of commerce itself. Dark cinematic close-up of thick gold chains coiling around an iron-bound ledger of international credit. In the theater of modern financial dominance, you must apply the exact same doctrine of the bottleneck. You identify the critical node in your industry, the intellectual property, the sovereign distribution channel, the proprietary supply chain, or the regulatory license, and you seize it with absolute focus. Once you control the bottleneck, you dictate terms, enforce pricing power, and command margins that competitors operating in open commodity spaces can never achieve. Cinematic slow-motion shot of a black luxury car driving through the iron gates of an isolated, ultra-modern compound nestled in alpine mist. The fatal mistake in systemic execution is overextending your perimeter before your core territory is economically fortified. When King Philip II of Spain sat atop the wealth of the New World, mountains of silver poured into the port of Seville. Yet Spain declared bankruptcy 4 separate times during his reign. Why? Because the wealth was consumed in endless, poorly calculated foreign wars and luxury imports, rather than being reinvested into productive internal capacity and sustainable infrastructure. Macro close-up of silver bullion melting and dissolving into liquid slag inside an industrial furnace, glowing bright orange against dark charcoal. Silver flowed through Spain like water through a sieve, leaving the empire hollowed out and financially crippled, while the merchant banking houses of Genoa and Antwerp extracted the real, compounding value. Visibility and volume mean nothing without retention and strategic reinvestment. Dramatic shot of an empty, echoing throne room of weathered dark oak, cold light filtering through towering Gothic-stained glass windows. The sovereign strategist does not treat capital as a tool for personal indulgence. Every unit of currency is deployed as a disciplined soldier tasked with securing assets that generate non-correlated asymmetric yield. You do not buy toys. You acquire infrastructure. You do not expand for the sake of ego. You expand only when the acquisition provides structural defensibility against systemic collapse. Cinematic tracking shot alongside a high-speed freight train loaded with shipping containers cutting through a desolate winter plain at twilight. When you look at modern central banking, monetary debasement, and digital financial surveillance, the mandate for systemic execution becomes even more urgent. To remain sovereign, you must operate across multiple jurisdictions, hold hard assets outside the traditional banking perimeter, and maintain enough deep liquidity to strike when structural dislocations force weaker hands to liquidate prime assets at catastrophic discounts. Extreme macro shot of the balance wheel of a luxury turbulent movement oscillating with flawless, silent precision. In the words of Machiavelli, the wise prince must not only pay attention to current troubles, but also foresee future ones and forestall them with all his energy. For when seen from afar, remedies are easily found. But if you wait until they are upon you, the medicine will be too late because the disease has become incurable. Cinematic high-angle shot looking down into the spiraling stairwell of a dark, stone fortress tower, descending into shadow. This is the discipline of the third stage, turning chaotic market forces into predictable, compounding leverage, insulating your domain from external siege, and preparing the structural foundation for the ultimate phase, sovereign synthesis, perpetual defensibility, and absolute autonomy. When the third stage has locked your systemic fortresses into place, you cross into the fourth and definitive realm of the blueprint, strategic synthesis, perpetual defensibility, and absolute sovereign autonomy. Cinematic slow-motion shot of an iron-crested wax seal being broken open by a gloved hand under a solitary beam of cold light. This final phase is not about acquiring more. It is about ensuring that what you hold can never be stripped away by the cyclical tides of history. At this elevation of power, wealth transcends the crude arithmetic of currency. It becomes an invisible armor, an unassailable fortress that outlives political regimes, market collapses, and the fragile lifespan of the individual strategist. Dark, atmospheric wide shot of an ancient stone citadel, withstanding violent ocean waves, crashing against its jagged sea cliffs at dusk. Most men who achieve a fleeting burst of prosperity inevitably fall victim to the fatal hubris of the triumphant. They assume that the tactics that brought them out of obscurity are sufficient to defend them at the summit. They forget the fundamental law that Machiavelli inscribed into the core of his political realism. Fortune is a raging river that drowns the valleys when she is unrestrained, but the prudent prince builds dikes and dams during times of tranquility, so that when the waters rise, their fury is channeled into harmless canals. Macro shot of an antique brass compass resting steady on a pristine navigation chart, while dark, turbulent storm waters churn outside a ship's window. If you have watched this far, you already possess a rare commodity that 99% of the modern world has surrendered to instant gratification: the discipline to study the long, patient mechanics of absolute leverage. Cinematic tracking shot across a long obsidian conference table where a single crystal decanter reflects the faint illumination of distant city lights. The synthesis of Machiavellian wealth requires you to operate on 3 non-negotiable principles of sovereign preservation. First is the principle of complete institutional detachment. Your core assets, intellectual dominion, and operational levers must never be tethered to the goodwill of a single government, currency regime, or corporate monopoly. A sovereign does not beg for favorable legislation or panic when central planners alter the rules of the game. He anticipates the regulatory trap decades before it springs, positioning his resources across diversified, non-extraditable economic jurisdictions. Cinematic low-angle shot of towering black monoliths standing immovable in the center of an ancient desert plain beneath a starless night. Second is the doctrine of internal loyalty through structural dependency. In your inner circle, you do not rely on sentimental gratitude. Men change their loyalties the moment a more lucrative benefactor appears. You retain absolute control by ensuring that the wealth, safety, and future of every essential lieutenant is inextricably bound to the preservation of your central engine. When their ruin is the direct consequence of your fall, their vigilance will match your own. Close-up of interlocking mechanical iron gears coated in dark oil, turning in total silent synchronization. Third is the mastery of the sovereign retreat. Machiavelli observed that the greatest commanders never allow an adversary to force a battle on unfavorable ground. When the macroeconomic terrain shifts against you, you do not fight the tide with stubborn vanity. You execute a disciplined, orderly consolidation, liquidating vulnerable satellite operations, pulling reserves behind deep jurisdictional moats, and letting your competitors exhaust their capital fighting over scorched, unprofitable earth. Cinematic slow-motion shot of a black stallion standing poised on a mist-covered hill overlooking a distant, burning valley at midnight. Consider this strategic dilemma. If a rival power offered you an alliance that instantly tripled your current capital, but required you to reveal the internal architecture of your private supply chains, would you accept the immediate expansion of your treasury, or reject the offer to preserve your absolute asymmetry? The answer to that question reveals whether you are still a mercenary seeking gold, or a sovereign securing an empire. Extreme macro shot of a single drop of black ink falling into clear water, blooming into complex, irreversible plumes of shadow. The blueprint is complete. The 3 stages have been laid bare. From the calculated dissimulation of the silent apprentice, through the ruthless psychological leverage of the rising commander, to the unassailable systemic fortresses of the sovereign architect. Cinematic tracking shot, receding down a vast marble hall lined with ancient statues, the heavy iron double doors slowly closing into absolute darkness. To examine the exact psychological mechanisms that master strategists use to neutralize hostile boardrooms and eliminate competitive threats without firing a single shot, proceed immediately to the classified dossier appearing on your screen now.